Who Are You? With Geoff Hutchinson.
Today on Who Are You, you're going to meet a man who as a boy had the most extraordinary childhood. With others, entrapped in a bizarre and sometimes brutal cult known as the Family, founded by a woman called Anne Hamilton Byrne. His name is Ben Shenton, and in 1987 he was among, I think, 6 kids who were rescued and taken into protective custody after the cult's property was finally raided by police. The story of the family is being told in a new documentary, and I'm very glad to have Ben in the studio to talk about it. Ben, good morning to you.
Good morning, Geoff. Thanks for having me.
My questions are pretty loaded to you this morning. Who are you?
By the time I was 15, I'd had 3 different names. Started out on the birth certificate as Andrew Bellman Shenton. Spent the first 15 years being known as Benjamin Saul Hamilton Byrne. And by the time I was removed from the property at Lake Eildon, which Anne used to bring all of us up, I became Ben Andrew Shenton. I was born by my mother, who was a sect member, in 1972. By the time I was 18 months, she had handed me over to Anne, and under direction had nothing to do with me until 2006, which was a chance meeting. Talk about further. August the 14th, 1987, by the time that my 3 elder sisters, quite heroes in my view, wrote to the police, 40-page statements enumerating what had gone on, and 100 police descended at 7:30 in the morning and rescued us. And what followed there was a guy who, as the years went by, had to process all of that, and now I'm a proud husband of Rajis, my wife. I've been about to celebrate our 25th anniversary. 2 kids, my daughter Ellie's 18, my son's 15. Work as a project manager, met the real Jesus Christ, and I'm a happy contributing member of society in the Potter's House Beachborough congregation here in Perth.
It's an incredible story, and I have to take you right back to the point where your parents, Joy and Peter, were members of the cult, handed you over to Anne Hamilton Byrne. On what basis, what rationale does someone do that?
Look, Anne offered people ways of overcoming just the general challenges that everyone faces in life. I guess, the waves of storms that overtake us. My mother became part of this cult over in Melbourne. She had major physical issues, bedridden, and had become part of Anne's yoga classes. And yoga in the 60s was the new age sort of movement stuff anyway. So it would have been the mid-60s as she became part of this cult, bedridden. Anne came and basically offered redemption for her, healed her. And when she shacked up with my father, which was over in England, Anne had sent them both over there. She came back to Australia, had me very close to Lake Eildon at a place called Alexander. And my father, as Anne did, was sent back to England. My mother, by the time I was 18 months, was directed by Anne, come look after my headquarters in Melbourne, a place called Winborough, in Upper Frenchie Gully in the Dandenongs. But you can't have your son with me. Or with you, I should say. So an agreement was made that I'd become Anne's child, hence my name got changed to Benjamin Saul Hamilton Byrne. And as a single mother, she happily stepped into the background, knowing that the property where I'd been, she'd spent time there, was wonderful. She thought idyllic, and an agreement was made that she'd have no contact with me whatsoever.
The extraordinary thing about this story is that this was not a one-off. This was sort of the pattern by which children became part of the family. So let me ask you, who was Anne Hamilton Byrne? And how do you reflect on answering that all these years later?
Yeah, she's a woman that is a product of her upbringing. Her mother had major mental issues, and by what Anne had said, was heavily involved in the occult, directly communicating with spirits, dead people, reading all sorts of stuff. So Anne grew up in and out of homes, separate from her parents. She attempted to build a reality around her where she had complete control of it. She used Eastern mysticism. She used to hand out books that very much connected Western and Eastern culture, and laid out a reality for people that spoke of reincarnation, that spoke of stuff that she could do. So I grew up believing she was my mother, but very aware that she was rarely around and she was in complete control of every aspect of my life.
More than your mother, she described herself, and others described herself as a female incarnation of Jesus.
Yep.
And a living God.
Yes. So,
and that is as you believed it as a kid?
As a kid, yes. That's what we saw. I very clearly remember several occasions where Anne was under the influence of psilocybin mushrooms and LSD, had us in the meditation room, as it were, and was telling different ones of us, you're in a previous life was the Apostle Peter, you were Paul, you were John, and very much set herself up to be the reincarnation of Jesus, that she was Jesus Christ. And that's something she did time and time again with everyone that she was after controlling.
As we see in this documentary, there's a lot of home movie film of Anne Hamilton Byrne, a very beautiful, mesmerising personality, very attractive personality. For people who will be unfamiliar with this story, we just need to establish, how was it that all you children ended up at Lake Eildon calling this woman who was not your mother, Mum? How was she able to procure, because this is what she did, how could she procure children?
Okay. So it's an interesting time in the 60s. I'd call it a seedbed of creating a social problem that Anne appeared to help to fix. So you have the hippies very much rejecting the Judeo-Christian roots of morality, rejecting free sex, love who you want to, when you want to. We're living in communes, we're communist, we're rejecting the establishment. And the product of that is 15, 16, 18-year-olds is you're going to end up with children. So in the 60s, as that began to occur, at least in Melbourne, you had these single mothers that were very often sent away from the known family and society. And even my mother began to help to look after these people while they had these children, these single mums that were struggling, provided a place for them. So Anne stepped in, as it were, and said, I will provide a place. These mothers, very single mothers, that often would be distraught going to their doctor.
Of course.
The doctor or a sect member would bring them. Mothers out of institutions, hospitals, which were sect members, would help to procure that. And with my mother, she turned her into a single mother and said, I'm going to help you.
Yeah, so let's talk about adults as sect members. Tell me about Raina Johnson, because certainly Anne Hamilton Byrne had very willing supporters, and they were significant professional people in Melbourne, weren't they?
Yes. So Dr. Raina Carey Johnson would have been one of the most respected academics in the world at that time. He came from London, and you can go back through, and he was a published author, very much involved in physics. Spectrography was his area of professionalism. By the time he came to Australia, he began to reject the divinity of Jesus Christ. He became part of the Queen's College, which is a Methodist college in Melbourne University, incredibly well-respected academic position in Australia. So from 1932, I think, to 1964, he was the dean of the Queen's College. And so by that stage, and there's a book that's been written by Rosie Jones and Chris Johnson that does quite a very good job of analysing this, and it's something I've known very well. So he provided a professional, well-respected, well-connected front to the sect. When I say well-connected, you've got Ansett.
Yes.
He had a very close friend, Pratt, who had died, and he went to... Raina Johnson wanted to stay in contact with him and went and found a medium over in England where he could do that. And so he very much began to delve into, I would call, the occult, mysticism and all of that. And
all of it hidden from view by the validity of his
position,
professional middle-class decency.
Yes.
And there are going to be some big questions too about the fact, did those people of power and influence, were they able to get help from police and government that basically stopped you being freed when you might have been freed? And that question was asked again and again. I think there's in the documentary there's a Channel 10 reporter who's done some stories about the group. Reg Ansett, who's tied up with Channel 10 at the time, says the next report you do will be one that says how good this organisation is.
And Raina Johnson went to him as a friend going, the first one that he did, the expose looks bad on us. We are not like this. You know me. And hence that direction. And that happened time and time again.
Okay. I'm already sensing that we might stretch this just past 10 o'clock this morning because there's so much to talk about. I want you to tell me, Ben Shenton, what life in this camp was like. Lake Eildon's a very beautiful place. If people have had the opportunity to see it, it is a beautiful place. But what was life like in the camp where you grew up with dyed blonde hair?
Life behind the wire is what you're after. Look, it was very regimented and controlled that down to minute detail with a rule book that she would lay out rules that we would live by and sign her name across them. We were looked after by a group of women and one man.
Just to put some context too, because Anne and her husband Bill were often in England, so they weren't living with you.
And America.
Yeah, they weren't with you the whole time. They would come back, and if you look at any of the footage of the time, you see these delighted children rushing into the arms of Anne and Bill. And I think in the documentary there was some mention made that the children had been promised chocolate.
Well, when Anne and Bill came, it was a break from routine. It was a break from the punishments that we'd gone through. We saw them as this finally, everything's going to be wonderful and lovely. So you looked forward to them coming, and they were only there on weekends. Very rarely did they stay through the weekdays.
So it was a group of women called aunties who looked after you. What did a day look like? Because I do understand that every day was the same as the next one.
Very, very similar. So it was up very early. The boys' room was, we're talking around 5:30. The boys' room was turned into where we slept, was turned into a schoolroom. But before it was done, we'd all gather and do hatha yoga and meditation. Very quickly, it would then morph into the breakfast, which is fruit, a couple of pieces of fruit. You would then do your exercises. School would be up to classic morning, like any school day, it followed through, but lunchtime was meditation, then lunch of vegetables. Afternoon, evening, you'd pack down, everyone would have the shower, clean up, turn back into the boys' room, meditation before dinner. Sometimes, quite often for a period of time, there was another session of hatha yoga. And then it was dinner, which was vegetarian-based, very, very rarely meat at all, if ever, and homework, bed. Every day the same, every week the same? Very similar. Weekends were slightly different. We'd have a gentleman who used to be at Croydon High School as a maths and science teacher would come up, and he would teach us through the weekend and go back down. Is it true that much of what you were told as the children of Anne was that the world was coming to an end and it would be your responsibility to re-educate the world after this one was destroyed? That was something that filtered through. It wasn't spoken about often. It was just something you were aware could happen. And I think as we became aware of what Raina Johnson had said and what he'd written in his diaries, it brought clarity that was the plan. So we were always brought up believing that we had a special mission. What that was became clear as we got out of the cult. What about outsiders? What about the prospect that you would ever come into contact with anyone else, a police officer or anyone else? So we were taught that the police were going to take us away in a bag. They were going to beat us. We were taught that anyone outside of the sect was not allowed to talk to them, or if we did, we were given what we were supposed to say. So the motto of Unseen, Unheard, Unknown, which Sarah wrote about in a book back in 1995, was what we all lived by. And I'm not just talking us kids, everyone in the sector. What did that motto mean? You were not to be seen by anyone. So all that was done was hidden. So on the property we were, they kept that secluded with trees so no one could see in. Everyone appeared to be a diligent professional individual for the adult sect members, helping society, doing what was necessary you'd never guess. unknown as far as what was being done, what Anne's plans were of what happened day to day, and unheard of, obviously not speaking, not telling.
Do you have a memory of that time that is particularly strong?
Many. My 15 years, or the 13 and a half years I spent the early memory up until I was 15 are very vivid memories of...
So when I mention, I don't mean to ask the question and then interrupt, but when I mention one of these aunties, when I mention Elizabeth Whittaker to you, what can you summon?
A lady who was very complicit with what was going on. Her husband, Howard Whittaker, had been one of the psychiatrists who administered LSD and left after ABC Four Corners report on him. She had remarried by then. I remember her as one of the senior aunts who'd come up 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. She had a very slow burning temper, but when it lit, it was terrifying. Yeah, she would lose the plot. I remember several occasions where she'd wheeled this metre-long ruler around and wrap around people's ribs. On one occasion, she had gone to sleep with the fan on and forgotten that had happened, assumed we'd turn that on, and all hell broke loose on that. And several of the older brothers of mine who was in the same room at the time were beaten black and blue about that, just in a rage. So when she snapped, it was terrifying, and she adhered rigidly to the rules that Anne had in that book that ministered out punishment from hands being held over candles to dunkings in water, lack of meals for up to 3 to 7 days at a time.
Deprivation of food was a big issue, wasn't it?
A major issue. You could control that very easily. And depriving the ability to be able to form relationships with anyone as well. So that was very strongly...
Let's talk about that. You and your brothers and sisters and your relationship with them. Again, I can see movie footage that shows happy, smiling little kids in their identical, it was described last night as sort of Von Trapp kind of outfits. What kind of relationships were you able to have with those other kids?
Look, it's a relationship that has endured to today. So that, I think, came from a lot of being in something common together.
Yeah.
While we were in it, I struggled with those relationships.
Because they weren't encouraged. Nothing was encouraged,
nothing.
was
In
it?
fact, they any time we got close to one another, Anne would purposely separate us. So it was very much if you cannot form a relationship with anyone where love is unconditional, you are then able to totally craft that person's identity and manufacture it. So that's what Anne would do. She would separate us from each other if we got close. I remember on many occasions, one of the younger brother I had, you'd get frustrated, and Anne had the ability to cause others to be punished based upon what you said if it suited her. So I remember on several occasions causing one of the younger brothers to be locked away, in a shed where it was cold. He suffered from asthma.
Because of something
many
you'd
breathing
said?
problems. And so to have the ability to get him locked away in bathrooms, the ability to have him locked away in a shed was something I held over him and used when it suited me. So Anne encouraged that sort of behaviour. There was another one of the older boys at the time, I told on him and he ended up getting punished. Another one, water thrown. Anne had this power and we could use it appropriately if we wanted to.
How vivid, I know the answer to this question, but how vivid is that? And your sense of personal shame is as evident today as it must have been then.
Yeah, it's very vivid. And, having spoken finally to one of the boy that I did that to, who's now a father of 4 kids, lives outside the country. I spoke to him last year. He's naturally very forgiving. You do these things just as the rough and tumble of life, brothers competing with each other, and we're in an environment where you do what you had to do to survive. So he's processed that and stuff, but it does help to say sorry.
You said very lightly earlier, you mentioned LSD, and a number of the children have memories of being given drugs, including LSD and mushrooms. Were you?
I was very fortunate not to be. So it wasn't LSD, it wasn't the psilocybin mushrooms. I was still 14 and Anne hadn't come back to the country. So once she returned, I would have been given that, or if I went to England to go to boarding school, as was planned, that would have happened. So for me, it was all the other prescription drugs.
Other prescription drugs?
Mogadon, Tegretol,
Valium.
Gactyl, Valium, and I could
Why
not,
were you given them?
to sedate us, to control us. And you're dealing with psychiatric nurses, you're dealing with Anne, who very much understood the power of drugs and what they do, and it was used to control us. And as well, when one of the older girls ran away, when she was returned prior to turning 17, 18, they would just show the prescriptions that said she's got mental issues, here's the drugs she's on, trust us.
My guest on Who Are You today, and what we will do is take this just past 10 o'clock because there are some things that we want to continue to talk about. The extraordinary story that Ben Shenton is sharing with us, his life with the family. Your kids don't have a relationship. All you do is work at the task. Did you ever have a sense that this life of yours was unusual? Was the construction of someone else?
Yes, it's interesting. The place was known as Keilama officially. It was referred to as up top, and there was great periods of time when we called it the concentration camp. So even though we knew nothing else, even though we struggled with ever believing there could be another world for us, we knew there was another world out there, and what we were going through was not good. And two of the younger children suffered from psychosomatic dwarfism. They did not grow. So even then we knew, the youngest one, that this was not normal, as they would inject her with growth hormone drugs.
And one of the things that we understood and just touched on, this whole issue of food, do you remember feeling hungry a lot of the time?
Yeah, you were not 100% of the time, but yeah, there were periods of time where you would be hungry, or you knew it was a very bland diet. And what was interesting is when the boys were due to go over to England, their breakfast changed from fruit into being given eggs, bacon and toast.
Yeah, because that was the natural path. Just explain that to us. As you got older, the expectation was that boys would go over to England, actually to boarding school, or to live with Anne and Bill there?
To boarding school.
Where did the money come from this?
It was given to Anne by people like my mother, who was a wealthy Jewish lady, and many others that worked for it. And then there was the fraudulently acquiring off the government, as they paraded, or they stated they were single mothers with dependents. So money was acquired either by wealthy business people, fraudulently, and under the pretext that Anne was doing these wonderful things to help animals and these children.
Yeah, and I saw in the documentary that even a school inspector came along in 1984, and complicated calculations had been put up on a blackboard to impress him, and his observation was how polite and well ordered and terrific everything was.
And, without blowing a trumpet, we were intelligent kids that were being educated and knew those things. That wasn't fake. I was able to step out of that into year 10 and hold water. Several of us have gone on and got university degrees, professional, one became a doctor, on and on it went. So we weren't fools, and it's very easy when you're educated what to say to present this persona with all the schoolwork that we did that was there. So yeah, it was designed to keep the world at bay and make it appear as if this was idyllic, this was perfect, nothing to see here, move along.
And after 10 o'clock, I'll ask you that question. Why did everyone seem so complicit? Why did police have such difficulty? Why did government not seek to intervene? Because police were regularly asking questions over what was happening.
Who Are You? With Geoff Hutchinson.
Good morning. I don't mean to throw you off beam by playing a little sting for Who Are You, but if you've been with us for much of the last half hour, you'll know that I'm telling Ben Shenton's story. Ben was a member of the family, a cult founded by a woman named Anne Hamilton Byrne. And it wasn't until 1987 that Ben and 6 other kids were finally rescued from the place that they had called home for the last 15 years. It is the most extraordinary story. Thank you to those people who have expressed your interest in it. Send us a text to 0437 922 720. We've gone through the early life. We've tried to learn about the motivation of Anne Hamilton Byrne and what life was like for Ben and his brothers and sisters. They weren't really brothers and sisters. They were kids who had been taken from parents, whisked away at different times. So, Ben, thank you for staying with us. In 1987, there's a tip-off and police raid the place. How well do you remember that day, and where did the tip-off come from?
Remember it very well. I was just saying during the break, I'm in the process of writing a book, and that's the first chapter, which can be downloaded for free off the rescuethefamily.com, just to do a plug on that. Very naughty, but yeah, very vivid memory of that day. The tip-off came from three of my older sisters, who I refer to as heroes. They took great step of faith, considering that we believed that police were there to destroy us. We were hidden away from them when they came in a dark recess under the house. So they went to them knowing that Anne was going to be coming back to Australia and we would all go through the LSD treatments. And so that tip-off came as and that's a lengthy story in itself, we don't have time for, but in essence, they wrote statements, they agreed, they got some of the pages out of Anne's rule book that she'd signed her name against, got that to the police to verify what they were saying was true. It wasn't fabricated. And August the 14th, 7:30 in the morning, was always going to be a special day. Bill had been in Australia for 6 weeks and was headed back very soon. We were going to go on a picnic, and instead of that happening, we got set free. So they descended upon that place. I remember hearing them running down the stairs, thinking it was just the aunts dashing down to catch us not doing hatha yoga. And there it was, suddenly these people we didn't recognise.
Were you terrified or were you excited?
I was not wanting to leave. As I said earlier, I was due to head overseas to
boarding school.
I was about to get out of here through a path that I thought would be good, even though I knew that two of the older brothers had struggled at boarding school. I'd been over to England and not even allowed to talk to them about it. So they went from one to another, but for me it was the escape. So suddenly to have that taken away from me, I fought against that as the police tried to remove me physically. Fought against that.
So what did that look like? All these kids, all these police, the aunts, but not Anne or Bill?
Bill was there.
He'd
come up the night before, so...
Did the aunts give you instruction to sort of seek to hide or anything like that?
No, none of that. They were caught completely by surprise.
Yeah.
And the three older girls were there to comfort, direct and help, and we were herded out of there very quickly. Onto a bus and driven away. I mean, it probably was no less than half an hour from memory. It was a very quick, and the police had circled, which is why there was 100 of them, had circled the property in case we were whisked away and they were unable to come and rescue us.
You were placed in foster care?
Eventually, yes. In foster care, after my own request for that to happen. We got moved to St John's Home for Boys and Girls eventually, kept together, and the cottage parents there very quickly worked out there was an older group and a younger group, and they weren't equipped to handle the older girls that were 18, 19 by this stage.
What's going on in your head at this point?
I'm struggling to fit into society, heavily depressed, no reference points to connect with people.
Do you have a sense that you've been lied to? Or
completely.
You are?
Yes. So I find out who my mother is. Anne's not. It was a bad surprise for me, which was based upon how Anne had conveyed who our mother was, which she was a very different person to what had been conveyed. So that was horrible. My mother rang me very shortly after on direction from Anne and said, "I don't want to have anything to do with you. Don't bother turning up on my doorstep. I'll slam the door in your face." So it was isolated. I'm looking for parental figures, knowing I need that. Wanted to be fostered out. The cottage parents I got very close to got sacked because they asked to separate the group. Yeah. I moved in with a foster mother who happened to be a born-again Christian and just began to try and live life, get through high school, had to repeat year 11 twice.
What did you want most? Love?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was looking for stability, for love, for a solid foundation to build life on that would work. And by the time I took a trip around Central Australia with the school group, with what I thought were friends, and it became very obvious that I was very ill-equipped to handle life. As one of the maths teachers who ran it told me, Ben, you're not going to be able to connect with people. They have 11, 12 years worth of relationship here that you don't have. And it became very obvious as I came back, I was sinking, and I was determined to swim and find what the answers were.
At 18, you become a born-again Christian. You go on to become a pastor in Ballarat as part of the Potter's House Christian Church. Now, the head of that is here in Beachborough.
Yep.
And that's why you live here today. There's a whole period of your life that we won't have time to talk about. But a couple of questions, mate.
Sure.
What are the other kids that you shared your life with? What was their life like in a post-family world? Because some of it was just disastrous.
Look, as we spoke about before we went on air, one of the girls, and she was a lady, she passed away last year, very prematurely. She was the face. She wrote this book, Unseen, Unheard, Unknown, helped people, became an MD, drug addiction.
This is Sarah.
This is Sarah, got struck off the registry, being able to practice. Just a tragic life, and ended up heart failure, I believe, last year very, very sad. Others have had mixed success, some very successful in academia. I believe I'm one of the few, in fact, I think I'm the only one who's held a marriage together for the full period of time. I'm about to celebrate 25 years. Others have had children, and one of them's done an outstanding job with her children. Any father would be very proud of how she's brought those kids up. Others have never had kids and probably never intend to.
And in the time,
a whole mix.
In the time we've got left, we have to talk about whatever happened to Anne Hamilton Byrne. And this documentary features a very determined police officer who spent a very long time trying to have her prosecuted. They were extradited from the United States. Mm-hmm. They came back and faced some charges. This is back in the mid-1990s, some charges, they never went to jail. There was a $5,000 penalty.
Yep. And
the wall of silence and the wall of protection never truly came down, did it?
Yeah, it didn't. Justice was, and it's interesting, when you say justice, all of us inherently understand, because we're based upon what the Word of God has to say, that when someone damages someone else, when someone breaks the laws that are based on the Bible, there should be consequences. And the intention is redemption of the individual, but a recognition they've done wrong. And there's laws in Australia, in the Western world, that hold us together. Anne broke those. Anne violated those. She damaged children's lives, stole off people, and she should have faced justice. So anyone who uses religion or uses some ideology to get away with that, it's criminal.
She did a lot of television interviews at different times. I want to just play a tiny little bit of one so people can hear her voice, talking about why you kids all had that dyed blonde hair.
I wanted them to look like brothers and sisters, though. I must admit this. I love them. I love them in their little smocks and jeans and the long hair and ribbons. It was beautiful. It was lovely to see.
Why did you start to take in the children?
Over 21 years, 28 young people went through our hands.
Why did you do that?
I love children.
What do you think when you hear that voice today?
The last words, I love children. Love desires a long-term good of someone and is willing to pay the price to make that happen. It's selfless, it costs, because you desire to release them and for them to have a successful life and be the very best they can be. That's not Anne.
Today, Anne Hamilton Byrne, amazing, I think, is in her mid-90s, living in a dementia ward of a nursing home in Melbourne. Do you ever think about her? Did you ever see her again? Did you ever talk to her?
I did. 2 occasions. One of the girls got married and Anne happened to be there with Bill, and I had a very brief conversation, which I made sure stayed very brief during that time. Then my mother eventually removed herself out of the cult, as I met her first in 2006 when I went to see my grandmother, who was still alive then, and began to form a relationship with her. She used to come to Australia and stay on sect property back in the hills and look after everyone's cats and dogs as they depended on her to do that. This time, I think it was 2011. I think as I look back at the dates, actually just last night. So 2011, she came and stayed with me, which had never happened before. And one of the things she wanted to do...
There must be a lot of forgiveness in your heart.
Yeah, there has. I've been forgiven by Jesus, and he commands us, forgive as you've been forgiven. And truly, as he says, it'll binds up the broken heart and sets the captive free. So that has happened, the necessity to forgive, yet at the same time not allowing restoration of relationship until it's based on something that's genuine.
You don't see evil? You didn't see evil when you looked in her eyes? Because certainly...
My mother or Anne?
Anne.
Anne. And I believe beyond forgiveness. She's dementia. She knew what she did. She wielded demonic power, and everything she touched, eventually, as you give it time, was destroyed. And that is evil. As Lex DeMann said, she's probably one of the most evil persons she's met. And when you create a facade that destroys people but appears to be loving and caring, that is the greatest form of evil.
Last observation. The cult still exists. The family still exists. There are people who appear in this documentary who think that you kids are somehow victims seeking to twist the story of Anne Hamilton Byrne. I could not believe it when I saw it. How can this thing exist still?
Because it's amazing the lies people will believe when they reject the truth. And that's reality what it is. When you reject the truth that God lays out of how to live life, of who he is, when you begin to go down the path of the occult and dabble in these things where you see signs and wonders, and the Bible says you will be defiled. In other words, ruined, destroyed. That's exactly what's happened. And the guy you speak of who's in the thing was a Jew, made a very considered decision to reject God and came up with a lie. And then you invest so much in that to remove yourself and to rewire all of that becomes a very costly thing to do. And my father on his deathbed, from what my mother said it's part of the biggest hoax the last 40 years of what we've ever been involved with. And I think you'll find this gentleman, Michael Stevenson, Helmer Stevenson will say the same. When he's about to step into eternity, this was a hoax, this was a lie.
Ben Shenton, thank you for joining us on Who Are You?
Thank you.